Hey everyone, Charlie Morgan here and welcome to this training video. This is knee-jerk objection rebuttals and in today's training video I'm going to be explaining how to overcome some of the initial objections that you may find people have either before you've pitched them, during the pitch or after the pitch. So this is obviously related to decision makers and the objections that they might sort of have, whether it's I'm not interested or can you email me, or I'm already working with an agency. You know, these things that business owners perceive to be problems that may stand in the way of getting the deal done. We need to sort of overcome them and be able to bypass them. So yeah, we're going to sort of walk this through. These objections, like I said, they can come up at any point with the decision maker. They might have this objection when you ask for the 30 seconds. They might have it whilst you're pitching. They might have it after you've pitched. That you might be about to book a call and they say, yeah, let's book a call, and then they have it. So, you know, there's no real exact expected time as to when these arise. But what I'm going to do in today's video is equip you with an understanding of, first of all, why they happen and what we can do about it, and then second of all, like sort of what exactly you should say and everything like that. So yeah, this is knee-jerk objection rebuttals. Let's jump in and get started. So here's what we're going to cover today. First of all, 2 points on sort of perspective and how to look at it. So the first one is cold calling objections are not traditional objections. We're going to cover something really cool in psychology that will help you understand why these objections come up. Then we're going to talk about pattern interrupts, and then we're going to talk about cold calling, the objection rebuttal resource that we have. Okay, so the first thing to understand here is that when you're making cold calls, objections aren't actually objections. Okay, and I'm going to explain what this means. When you're on the phone to a decision maker on a cold call, this is not a sales call, bear in mind this is a cold call. When you're on the phone to them and they object to your proposal or call, it's important to note that 9 out of 10 times the objection isn't coming from a place of business rationale, but something else. Right? People will give you stuff like I'm not interested, or send me an email, or I don't want to do this, whatever. Then those responses are not like thought through business responses. They're not based out of anything because the prospect doesn't even know what they're saying no to yet. So it's not a rational thing for them to actually say I'm not interested. It's something else. And that something else is because of something called classical conditioning. Okay, this is a really, really fundamental thing to understand in psychology. You may be familiar with it, you may not be, but I'm going to give you a brief understanding of how it works and why you need to understand it. So the whole objection thing when it comes to cold calling is usually a result of classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is a type of learning that happens unconsciously. Okay, when you learn through classical conditioning, it's basically it's like an automatic conditioned response is paired with a specific stimulus. Okay, so whether you know it or not, a huge portion of your behavior is automated by your brain purely through traditional association. So think about any habit that you have or anything that you do on autopilot without thinking about it. Whether it's, I don't know, it could be brushing your teeth in the morning, or a certain way that you wash your hair, or drinking water at certain times, or it could be anything, okay? What you've got to realize is your environment will give you cues, or your environment has cues, and your brain will use those cues to automate behavior. Okay, so a primary example of this is whenever I start a new training video, I'm sure you've noticed by now, I will say, hey everyone, it's Charlie Morgan here. Welcome to another training video. This video is called, and then I'll sort of explain the video. That's just a sort of classical conditioned response that I have to starting a new recording. It just happens unconsciously. I don't even think about that anymore. It's just what I say. And I've done it so many times that whenever the recording beeps and the video starts, it's just how I start every single video. It's just it's classical conditioning. It's just how it happens unconsciously. And so an example of this, when someone sneezes, you'll probably say bless you in most Western countries. This is generally an automated response to the sound of a sneeze, and it's the result of years and years of unconscious learning and observing this behavior in other people. So, you know, if you're on a train, if you're on a bus, or if you're with your family or your friends and someone sneezes, you're probably just going to say, oh, bless you. You know, and you don't even think about that response. It's not something that you consciously process. You just say it. It's like, achoo, oh, bless you. You don't, it's not something that you think about, but it's a behavior. It's a manifestation of action but we don't know that we're doing it because it's unconscious and it's just the way our brain is working, right? Another example of this is tying your shoelace when you put your shoe on, right? It's not a behavior you have to think about. It's just an unconscious if this, then that statement. So your brain has these, in summary, your brain has these like actions or responses that it will pair with certain cues and certain stimuluses. And so most of our behavior is automatic, and it runs through this part of our brain called the basal ganglia, which is a tiny part of the brain that's responsible for forming habits. And it just makes your brain much more efficient. And the reason we're conditioned like this is because the brain loves efficiency. I mean, being able to unconsciously react to certain cues without having to think gives us a huge advantage in terms of biology. It means our energy-hungry brain requires less calories to do stuff, because thinking and using cognitive processes is extremely costly from the body's perspective in terms of calories. And so the brain loves efficiency. It loves to sort of, conserve calories by just creating automatic responses that are unconscious, that we don't have to think about. And therefore, we imagine if every time someone sneezed, you had to actively think through what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to say? It would be exhausting. So yeah. And in biology, this is referred to as a click-word response. Basically where animals, most animals' behavior operates on classical conditioning, pretty much all of it, right? Because they can't think. Pretty much every single action that different animals take is a result of classical conditioning, right? For example, if you've got a cat and you put a bowl of food down, then the cat will walk over to the food because it knows that the food will be in that place. It will smell that certain way, and at the same time every day that bowl goes down, the cat knows it's going to be there. So this association starts to build up, right? Pretty straightforward stuff. And so you might have heard of this before, described as a knee-jerk reaction, where if you sort of like hit just like the sort of small of your knee below your kneecap, your leg will just fly upwards when you have no response. Like you have no, you have no conscious say in this. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. Now this is obviously related to your body, which is slightly different, but the principle still applies. If the stimulus hits the knee, the leg will fly up, right? If someone sneezes, you say bless you. These are things that we don't think about. These are things that happen unconsciously. Obviously, the body is slightly different from the mind in the way that it operates, but the principle applies. This is why we would call them knee-jerk objections. Okay, and this is really interesting because we can apply this to cold calling. Okay, because it gets really, really helpful to understand why people have these objections. Because when you understand why they have them, the method we use to overcome them makes so much more sense. It's very difficult to justify using a certain method to overcome objections if you don't understand why you're using it. And so you might be looking at this video thinking, I just want the list of rebuttals, please just, give me the resource and I'll be fine. But you're less likely to use the rebuttals if you don't actually understand why we use them and the certain methods we use. So how does classical conditioning apply to cold calling, and how does it also create objections? How does this sort of click word, knee-jerk classical conditioning response lead to objections? Well, here's classical conditioning in cold calling. Okay, so certain people will have certain automated responses in their brains when receiving a cold call or a cold pitch or DM or email for that matter. Think about this for a second. Consider what sort of response, what sort of automated response you have to people selling things in the street, or when you pick up the phone to realize it's a cold call, or when you receive a copy and paste pitch in your DMs. Put yourself in the shoes of the prospect here. It's a very powerful thing to do. If you're walking down the street, and a good example of this, right, is I just got back from Greece, and we were in this little town in Greece, and we were sort of walking down through this bay, and there were these chains of restaurants over to our right, and what we started to pretty quickly realise every time we went down to the bay is the restaurant owners would come out of the restaurant and they'd sort of stand in your way to try and get you to go into the restaurant. And the first time it happens, you're sort of like, well, I have no idea what to do. But after it happens once or twice, your brain sort of builds this sort of response where you just sort of say, hi, I'm not eating, bye, and you just sort of go by. And we observed people's behaviour. It was really interesting to see as they walk past these restaurant owners and how they sort of avoid them. And we started to notice, we were down by this bay quite often, and we started to notice that the same people would have the same responses every single time, right? And so, like, you know, when you're walking down a street, you might have someone that sells, it could be anything. When you're walking down the road, you probably give like an automatic response, which is probably no response at all. You just ignore them. Or if you pick up the phone and it's like some guy trying to sell you something, being all pushy, you're just like, oh, I'm not interested, or you hang up. It's just a knee-jerk response. We're not judging the person trying to sell us something. We're not trying to be rude to them. It's just our brain has produced this sort of automatic defense mechanism that brings itself up whenever this stimulus is presented. And it's a way of sort of protecting our time. It's a way of protecting our money. It's a way of protecting like our objective in terms of what we're trying to do in the moment. And so you've got to realize, like, if you consider that from your perspective and think about what you do when someone cold calls you, it will help you understand and empathize with what prospects do and why they will come up with these objections, which are 9 times out of 10 bullshit, but they're just automated responses. It's pure classical conditioning. Another example of this is in the DMs, right? So when someone sends me a copy and paste DM, like in my primary example that we get at the moment is people, virtual assistant agency saying, oh, we've got a VA that will work 40 hours a week for you, and they'll book 15 to 30. I just delete it. I don't even read it. Like, as soon as you'll look at, this is interesting, your brain starts to categorize stimulus, right? And so what you'll probably find is when you receive a cold DM or a cold email from someone else, a sales email, before you've even finished reading it, your brain will actually categorize it into something that you want to keep reading or something you want to delete. And so I know now when I receive a friend request from someone, I can categorize them, my brain will subconsciously categorize them into someone that I want to be friends with and actually add to my network, or someone that's probably just trying to sell me something, and I'll just remove the friend request. Or if they send me a message, I'll just delete it without even reading it or responding. And it's nothing personal, it's just an immediate response that I've got. So yeah, I mean, the key here to remember with objections on a cold call is that they aren't really objections at all. Okay, you're not dealing with the objection someone gives you. No, instead you're dealing with years and years and years of unconscious conditioning resulting in an automated response that you perceive to be something else. So you've got to understand, when you call someone up, you are a cue, right, to their behavior, and they will have an automatic response to your cue. And it's the way that we deal with that automatic response that will result in whether or not we get the meeting. Okay? So if someone says not interested or send me an email, they're not actually saying what they mean, right? They don't really want to receive an email from you. They just want to get rid of you. And they might actually be interested in what you have to say, but they're not thinking, right? When someone immediately says, if you call someone up and they say not interested, there's no thought that's gone into that in any way, shape or form. There's no, like I said, no business rationale has actually produced those words. It's purely just an automated response. There's no thinking behind it. And so what we have to do is we have to try and break this automated response to get the prospect to think. And when we get them to think, they actually start to come around to the fact that it might be a good idea. Okay? Because, this is just the way they've been programmed. It's so important to understand this stuff. And the truth is that objections aren't objections at all. They're automated responses to stimulus, just like the bless you example. So how do we overcome objections that result from classical conditioning? Well, we leverage and use something called pattern interrupt. You may have heard of this before. It's a part of a field of study called NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming. We're not really going to be touching too much on that, but you might be familiar with it, and we're going to take it slightly out of context, but it will still be useful. So when we talk about pattern interrupts, what I basically mean by this is, like, we have the cue, but like we are the cue as a cold caller, for example. But we want to interrupt the pattern so we look different and we're a different cue so that the prospect can't bundle us into the automated response they've already given us. Okay, so I want to give you an example with the Bless You Association, right? If that sounds like some sort of charity, but it's not. It's by this I mean if someone sneezes. So let's just take the classical example here. We've got person A, person B. Person A sneezes, and then person B pretty much immediately says bless you. And now consider this for a second. Let's say person A sneezes, but then at the top of their lungs screams, bless me. Now person B would not really know what to do because the pattern has been interrupted. That sort of click-whir, knee-jerk response that they have programmed into their mind cannot run or operate because the stimulus is different to what they usually expect. So when someone sneezes, initially the prospect's brain is like getting into gear to say bless you, but before they've got the chance to say bless you, the person screams bless me at the top of their lungs, and then their brain's like, whoa, that's different, I wasn't expecting that completely breaks the pattern. What do I do now? Is it appropriate for me to say bless you? Is it not? Do I whisper it? Do I say it to myself? Do I say, oh, are you okay? Why are you screaming? So it's a pattern interrupt. Just by adding that, bless me on the end, the person's like, oh, well, I'm not quite sure. What the hell? It'd be like if I started this video in a completely different way to normal. You'd probably be thinking like, what the hell? He started like the past 40, 50 videos I've watched have been started with the exact same frame, with the exact same slides, or with the exact same sort of format. Why is it totally different? That's weird. Now I'm thinking. Now I'm engaged, right? And there's a time and a place for this, because obviously we wouldn't want to start every new video with a completely different approach, because the reason we do it like this is because we've conditioned you to learn from us in this way, and that's helpful. And breaking that pattern would not be helpful. But in this instance, it does prove quite useful. Okay. And this is called a pattern interrupt, okay? So pattern interrupts are powerful but sometimes subtle actions that we can use to interfere with people's classical conditioning. This is where we take the existing stimulus, for example, sneezing, and we pair it with a secondary stimulus, for example, screaming bless me at the top of our lungs, right? When we do this, the prospect's brain will be uncertain as to what response is appropriate, forcing them to think and engage cognitive activity. So the absolute key here, this is the key. The key is to know that pattern interrupts remove the sort of click-whir, automated, unconscious response and get us to actually think about the situation and how to respond. So with objections, when someone has an objection initially on the call, all we have to do is get them to think and actually cognitively process the proposal that we've got for them. And that will completely break the pattern that they're used to seeing from salespeople. And it's ridiculously powerful. Another example of a pattern interrupt down here. I just sort of pull this one out of the bag. Pun not intended, you'll see in a second. Imagine you have a habit of eating sweets. Okay? Every time you start your commute to work and get on the train, you've programmed your brain to dig into the same pocket of your bag and get a bag of sweets. Right? But when you look down, so you get on the train one day, and you look down and you get on the train and you settle into your seat, and every day you go down and you grab that bag of Haribos or whatever it is you use to eat your sorrows away on the commute, and you look down and you think, oh, like I've got a new bag, and your sweets, you put them all the way at the bottom today. You haven't got that usual pocket that you open and zip and eat them from, and instead of unconsciously eating the sweets, there's now the stimulus, the cue is gone, right? We've removed the environmental cue to eat the sweets. And the sweets are still there, they're just in a different place. And so this seemingly random change in cue, it might make you question your habit. And you might be like, oh, I'm not going to eat the sweets today. Okay? This is why, this all goes back to your environment. And why, when it comes to healthy eating, for example, just don't buy bad food, because then you cannot eat it because the cue's not there. Topic for another day, but the same principle applies in sales. People have got these automated responses. And when we act a little bit different, they can't really bundle us up, and they have to think. And when they have to think, they have to answer our questions, and therefore they're engaged. So how does this apply to cold calling? Okay, well, if you've ever wondered why we open our cold calls like we do, in terms of the script we use, it's because we want to interrupt the pattern and association the prospect has with every other cold caller, right? Like the way we pitch and the way we open is designed to be different, so that the prospect cannot put our call into a box and give us an automated response. And this is also why we like to be different with our cold messaging and cold email approaches, right? Loom and selfie videos with cold messaging, they break the usual sort of pattern that people are used to. And they make the prospect think and actually, think about their response instead of just responding with a knee-jerk, not interested. And after you've pitched someone, they may have knee-jerk objections from classical conditioning, such as not interested or send me an email, even though you've pitched well. This is just how some people are. This is how some people are just conditioned. Like they're conditioned to give salespeople resistance, but it's okay. All you have to do is break the pattern and keep them engaged, which is what I'm going to show you how to do in a second. And here's the irony, the paradox of it. is that most salespeople have unproductive classical conditioning responses to objections. And it's these responses that mess with your sales, right? So, let's say we've got we're on a sales call and we call the prospect up and we pitch them. And, the prospect might give us a conditioned response like not interested. And then we would give the prospect a conditioned response like, oh, okay, I'll send you an email. Right, so it works on both ends here. And so what you have to do as a salesperson is you have to condition yourself to the right sort of answer. Okay, so I'm going to give you our rebuttals and our method of thinking and how we approach these, right? But if you don't make it a habit, if you don't condition yourself to do these things, you're going to be in trouble. The other thing as well is to remember that most of our conditioning and most of our habits are operating out of pain avoidance. And so if you're on a sales call and you've got these shitty responses to objections, 9 times out of 10 it's because you know what you need to say, but you're just too afraid to say it, right? Or you're afraid of some conflict. So now let's go through the cold calling objection rebuttal resource. This will be quite useful for you because this contains all of our rebuttals and the initial strategy that we actually use. So let's jump into this one and let's take a look at it. Okay, so this resource obviously shows you how to handle knee-jerk cold calling objections. Okay, so now we understand classical conditioning, we understand why these objections arise, we understand they're not really objections, right? They're just automated responses, and we also understand that the nature of this means that we can change people's minds or overcome these objections simply by breaking patterns. And honestly, the easiest way to break a pattern is just to get someone to think, and really the easiest way to get someone to think is actually to ask them a question. Okay, so this is interesting. I've got this thing called the initial strategy here. Because a lot of the time, all you have to do is just keep the conversation flowing and keep people engaged, and the objection will sort of just dissipate. It doesn't really hold any weight. And most of the time, people expect you to stop the conversation. So when you don't, and you continue asking questions, and you sort of acknowledge the objection, but you don't actually dive into it, you can sort of just get around it, right? So if someone's not interested, I'd be like, John, I knew you were going to say that. Before we call it quits, let me ask this. And then you say, are you able to handle 30 new members? Yeah, well, I suppose we can. Oh, that makes perfect sense. But what about this? And you sort of, you just keep going back through the conversation. You keep people engaged. A lot of the time with these initial objections, engaging with them is the thing that causes the death. Because remember, if we tackle these objections head on, there's nothing to really tackle. Right? If someone says not interested, there's nothing. If we start saying, oh yeah, well, the reason you should be interested, they're not interested. They're just an immediate response. If that makes sense. So here's an example. So the best way to overcome knee-jerk rebuttals is honestly, usually, to totally ignore them. Right? Don't even acknowledge their existence and continue with the call as if they didn't even happen. So I don't mean this. I don't mean this in terms of pretend that they didn't even say it. You still want to acknowledge it, right, and say, I get that makes sense, or I'm with you there, or I'm really glad you brought that up. You want to acknowledge, but you don't want to sort of go down the rabbit hole of handling them and have too much acknowledgement for it, if that makes sense. So you want to know they're there, acknowledge them initially for that first quick second, and then you sort of continue the conversation. So let's say someone says, I'm not interested. Let's say you sort of, let's say you've done your pitch, right? And the prospect's like, look, Charlie, I'm just not interested. No. So here, most salespeople would enter the prospect's frame and start handling the objection head on, or just give up, right? They'd be like, oh, well, yeah, you should be interested, or oh, well, why aren't you interested? The worst possible thing you can ask is why. If someone says why I'm not interested, you say why. Then what you're doing is you're getting them to justify and re-solidify the position they have of not being interested. It's a very stupid thing to do. It just doubles down and makes it double as hard to overcome. And by that point, if someone says I'm not interested, you say why, and they'll just come up with some bullshit. But then they give their initial knee-jerk reaction that has no weight. When you ask them why they have that, they then justify it and give it weight. And now they've actually got a genuine reason for not talking to you. So it's a pretty silly thing to do. Okay. So yeah, different question if someone's can you call me back in 2 weeks? You could say, oh, well, why 2 weeks from now? They'd be like, oh, I'm about to go on holiday. And then you learn that you can't always get people on the meeting immediately, straight away, right now. You've got to give them some time, and you have to work on their time frame. So here's what we're better to say, right? So I'm not interested. Most people would just jump into it. But I would just say, John, I thought so. Do you mind if I ask, or make sense, and then ask them the question? Right, and then you proceed into another question. So it's like conversational judo or aikido. You just go straight over your head. Like, oh, I knew you were going to say that. Let me ask this, and then you proceed to ask another question, and you'll have to come up with what you're going to ask, because obviously it's going to be niche by niche. Like, are you not interested? That's totally fine, John. Totally get it. Quickly, whilst I'm still here, and then you just jump back into what are you using for your live transfers at the moment? What's your show rate on the appointments that you get, just out of curiosity? Oh, okay. Well, how often are you getting people in the door? We move them from objection and automated response. We move them back to the problem. Okay, so all these questions should be geared towards redefining the problem and requalifying the issue that they have. And I gave you some questions in the initial script that you can use to sort of explore the pain points and dive it and sort of open it up. And once you don't even pay attention to these objections, people will just forget about them. Like, you break the pattern. They're usually expecting, and say, I'm not interested. They're going to expect you, like every other salesperson before you, to completely, melt under the pressure. And then but they're not expecting you to say, oh, John, that makes sense. I'm with you. Quickly, let me ask this. And then you go on. So you just want to keep the conversation going. And this will break the pattern. By ignoring the knee-jerk objection and asking a question that the prospect will, by the way, be unconsciously obliged to answer, their attention shifts from the objection back to the questions about their business and obviously the problem they have, right? So there is going to be some cases where someone says, look, Charlie, I'm not interested, and then you try and overcome it, and they say, look, this isn't for me, right? And you can try and overcome it. But then they might just be like, look, I'm absolutely sorted. I don't need any help. I'm really happy with how my business is going. I don't need anything from you. That's fine. Remember, we're doing these calls to establish that there's a fit. And so when you are handling objections, you must remember that sometimes people will have genuine reasons for not wanting to talk to you. And there are some objections that you should not try to overcome. Because if you try to overcome them and book the call, well, you're going to get a prospect that doesn't show up. Or, worst case scenario, is you sell someone that doesn't actually need what you're selling. And then you have chargebacks and disputes and essentially lawsuits down the line, which is just stupid. There's no point, right? So in short, the best initial strategy is to not even try to handle the objection. Just ignore it or lightly acknowledge it and then ask a question. Simple. And the secret to remember is this: most salespeople suck and have their own knee-jerk automated responses to objections like not interested. When you react like every other salesperson, the pattern cannot be broken in the prospect's mind. But when you react in a totally different way, you're going to get the meeting. Move them away from the objection and back onto the problem. Oh, Charlie, can you send me some information? John, I'm so glad you requested that. But before we go down that little rabbit hole, what's this? Or how does this work in the business? Or how big's your sales team? Oh, well, we've got I think five people. It's like, oh, well, how many, have they got completely full calendars? He's just completely forgot that he wanted an email. But he didn't even want an email. He was just trying to get rid of me. But I've sort of moved the attention from me back to him, right? Very powerful, very subtle. Really glad you said that, John. But before we jump into that, blah 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 blah, you just move on, right? People feel like salespeople feel obliged to jump into these objections and sort of try and get into the nitty gritty of them and handle it. Just don't. Just see them as these initial responses that don't really mean anything. They don't hold any weight. And move on. And attitude. Remember that everything else in sales, just like everything else in sales, attitude is the secret. You want to sound happy to hear their objections. I'm not interested. Oh, John, you've no idea how happy I am to actually hear that. Let me ask you this. just completely ignore it. Because when you sort of, you can move towards the objection. It's the other strategy is to sort of jump into it, but a lot of the time it's not really necessary. If this should always be your initial response. to any objection on an initial cold call. Not in actual sales calls, by the way, where you're actually trying to sell someone the product on a discovery call. We've got a different frame for that's introduced in the sales module. These objections are purely for cold calling initially, talking to the decision maker for that first 2 to 5 minutes. But you need to remember that attitude is the secret, right? You want to sound happy to hear their objections, and you want to remember that your emotional state of enthusiasm and confidence is extremely contagious. You need it to be extremely contagious. You've got to remember that emotions and attitudes are contagious, right? You just think, what do you do when everyone else in the room is laughing? You laugh, or you at least smile, right? As human beings, we are very emotionally attuned, and when we are with someone or talking to someone that's flat, we will become flat. When we're talking to someone that's up, we will become up, and by that I mean emotionally. So if you're talking to someone and you're sort of having a great time, and you're on a sales call and they give you an objection, you say, "Oh, John, I could not be happier you brought that up." Before I dive into that, I want to just quickly touch on this point, if that's all right. And then, how many leads did you hit last month? No, 100. Wow, damn, that's not too bad. How many of them showed up in the business? 30. Okay, so you lost 70 leads. Why do you think you lost 70 leads? And then you've just completely moved the conversation onwards, and we've forgotten about the objection. Okay? Then the thing is that if the objection does come back up, then it makes sense to move on to the next step, which is where we've got these rebuttals here. Okay? So like what I'm saying here, initially, all of your objection handling should initially follow this model, where we lightly acknowledge, but we don't actually jump into it, and then we sort of ask another question that takes them back towards the problem. But if the objection persists, right, if the person doesn't answer the question and it persists, then we want to move on to the rebuttals, okay? So these rebuttals here should not be your first port of call. They should be the second after you've tried the initial strategy. So what I've done here is listed, I think, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8, something like that, main objections that you'll face. Obviously there will be more depending on your niche, and it's up to you to sort of look at what we've got here and obviously just make some changes. But these are the ones that you'll get most of the time, right? So not interested. If someone says not interested, first things first, remember with all these objections, we use the initial strategy, but if it still persists, then this is what I'd say. So I'd say, look, John, of course you're not interested. You don't have enough information to be interested. The fact is, you don't know me, I don't know you. Why would you be interested? Right? We just ask them that question. They'll say, oh, well, I guess that's right. And then you'd say, well, now, John, when I called you, I knew you weren't going to be interested until you really saw what I've got. Now let me ask this. And you move back into the question, right? You get back onto the train of the conversation. We're still sort of we're not exploring this in too much detail. We're just sort of acknowledging, look, John, why on earth would you be interested? You haven't got enough information to be interested. You have no idea what I do. I've got no idea what you do. This call is purely to explore. Now, if we explore and you're still not interested, that's absolutely fine. But I'm not willing to let a potential business opportunity go to waste here, because we could help you make so much money and give you so much freedom, or help you solve so many problems in your business. And I don't want two little words like that to stand in the way of us potentially, maybe, perhaps doing that. Can we explore this? When we phrase it like that, it's very difficult to say no. So I'm busy, I don't have the time. John, I know you're busy, I know you don't have the time. And because you're busy and don't have the time, stuff like this never gets done, right? Let me ask you this. And you can use that same sort of model again. John, I don't want time to be the thing that constrains you here. The whole reason I've called you is because agency owners don't have the time to solve this problem. And it's something that stands in the way of them growing. And they're so busy and wrapped up in other things in the business that they can't actually think critically about this problem and solve it. And that's where we come in, and we're actually going to save you so much time in the long run. And I think it could definitely be worth us having a quick conversation to see if we can save that time for you and make your life a lot easier. Sound fair enough? Same sort of thing. Send me an email or send me over some information. I'd just say, okay, yeah, I'd be absolutely happy to do that. Let me send it over to you right now. While I'm doing that, let me ask you this, right? And you can get their email on the call. And we want to take this literally. We're going to send the information right now. Alternatively, you can say, I'm really glad you've asked. I'll happily do that. What we usually do in a situation like this is get something booked in, get a little call booked in, a little bit of time to talk. I'll send you over some information that details out what we do and everything. You can review it, and if for any reason after reviewing the information you don't want to talk to us, we can cancel that call. But 9 times out of 10, we usually find that people are fine anyway. Alternatively, what you can do is you can say, oh, what information would you like? And then they'll tell you what matters, right? Like, oh, I want to know about how you do this or how this works. And then you could literally just say to them, well, listen, let me explain it to you now. You know, they'll tell you what information that they want. And you just go ahead and explain what they need to know now to book the call. Simple. So we don't have the budget. This is interesting because, you know, people, when salespeople hear this, they assume it means the prospect doesn't have any money. But what the prospect's actually saying is they have the money, they just haven't allocated it for the specific thing that you're selling. Two very different things there. And so it's your job to get them to see the value in what you're selling so they do allocate it. And so I would say that makes total sense. You see, most of my business comes from people that we call because we think they might be a good fit. You know, you didn't call me, I called you. And because of that, why would you have a budget? You didn't even know this existed before this call. So of course you don't have a budget for it. Now let me ask you this, move back into a question. Back from, we try and get away from the objection and we try and get back to the problem. Let me try it for free or can I get a free trial? I'd first of all say I love that request. Hats off to you for asking. And then we explore it. We say, look, John, you know, the only reasons people ask for a free trial is because, well, there's one of three things. Either they aren't going to use it, they think it isn't going to work, or because they've been burned before. Out of those three things, which one do you think is most likely? And then they'll tell you, like, oh, I'm not going to use it. Well, why are you not going to use it? Well, because I don't have time. So the real objection is time. The objection is not let me try it for free. Or if they say, oh, I've been burned before, then we're suddenly dealing with a prospect who's had negative experiences before. And so before we can move them forward in the sales process, we have to address that situation. And you'd say, okay, well, that makes total sense. I'm actually glad you've brought that up because I know for a fact that I've been burned by vendors before, trying to help us out. And so I totally understand where you're coming from. Why did it not work for you? Oh, well, they just didn't communicate with us properly, or their lead quality was terrible. There's always these specific reasons as to why they think it didn't work before, and all you have to do is make them realize that those reasons don't apply when working with you. Straightforward. So we're already working with another agency. I'd say, look, John, almost everyone I talk to today is already working with someone else. You see the need, and there's a company that you have fulfilling that need, or at least part of it, or in some way. My goal on this call is simply to provide you with enough information so you can see that there might be, maybe there's not, but there might be another alternative. Now, I only need a few minutes of your time to see if this is even a fit for you. The last thing I want to do is waste your time. And also, I wouldn't want to waste my time as well. If after the first 5 minutes of the call we schedule, I don't see this being a fit and you don't see the value, we'll end it and we'll call it quits. Does that sound fair enough? You know, we get in these little micro concessions where we're like, oh, just let's schedule this discovery call. And I'll be able to tell within the first 5 minutes whether or not this is a fit for you, right? And if I don't feel it's a fit, and if you don't feel it's a fit, we'll end the call. There's no obligation to do the full call. We can establish pretty early on if we think it's right. If it's not, no stress. We'll call it quits. And that's fine. The other cool rebuttal I like to use here, when someone says I'm working with another agency, I'd say, oh, that makes perfect sense. Are you married to them? And the person's like, well, it's a complete pattern interrupts. They're like, well, what do you mean am I married to them? I'm like, well, you know, if you committed your heart and soul to that agency, is it the only agency you'll ever love? Well, no, I haven't done that. I wouldn't say that. That's what they say. You say, okay, well, are you open to the idea that there is somebody that might potentially, maybe, perhaps, be able to do a better job for you? Oh, I guess that might be true. Awesome. Well, what's the harm in a quick chat then? I guess there's no harm at all, right? You see? You know, you can use it like that. Now, bear in mind, you might be sort of sitting here thinking, how the hell am I going to come up with lines like that when I've been, not to pat myself on the back too hard here, but like you might be thinking, well, it sounds easy for me to sort of come up with these, but I've done thousands and thousands and God knows how many, probably tens of thousands of cold calls, but you know, you will find your own style and what model off of these. And then finally, if someone says, well, what do you do or how does it work? You know, obviously the aim of our game is to keep things quite vague. And so if someone asks you what you do, well, you just want to focus on the outcome. You simply state your offer and follow it with a question about their business. So you've got to remember, when someone asks you what you do, you have to sort of tell them, but you have to maintain control of the conversation. So you have to follow this answer with a question, right? That's why what you'll see here is pretty much all of these rebuttals we have end with a question of some description, because we need to move the call forward. We need to control the call in the direction we want it to go. If the prospect controls the call, we completely lose any potential close. So in this situation, like if someone says, what do you do with gyms? I'd say, well, John, we actually help CrossFit gyms get 30 new and qualified athletes in the door per month, typically for group training memberships. They've usually got quite deep pockets. We work on a pay on results basis. Now, let me ask you, John, out of your membership options, what would you want to sell the most of? Right? As human beings, we are conditioned to answer questions. Right? Your job is to know which questions you should answer and which questions you should avoid answering, and which questions you should ask. Okay? Let me ask you this, John. I can get you 30 people next month, but do you think that'll be too many? Too little? He'll be like, oh, well, that's the question. So those are the rebuttals that I've been using, or that we've used, that we've proven to work time and time again to get meetings. Obviously, you'll notice that I've sort of added a few extra lines in here, and you'll want to sort of figure out your style and how that works and everything. But the secret here is honestly just to not enter the prospect's frame, have a really positive attitude, and always follow with a question. Of course you're not interested, John. How could you possibly be interested? I'm just a British guy on the phone. I wouldn't be interested in talking to me, but there's a chance that you might be after you hear what I've got to say. Now, if we have a conversation and I explain what we do in full depth, which I haven't really got time to do now, but we can schedule some time, I'll explain what we do. If you're still not interested then, and if I'm not able to convince you that it's a good thing to do, and you don't see the value, then we will end the call, we will call it quits, and we will never talk again. But there's a chance that this could be one of the best things that you do for your business this year. And that's not out of my, those words aren't out of my mouth, they're from our clients' mouths and the testimonials and referrals we have. Would you like me to send you some testimonials so that by the time our call comes around, you're more confident that we can help you? Yeah, sure, send me some testimonials. And then he's committed to booking the call, right? So there's all sorts of little ways that you can sort of get around these. But the main thing is attitude, and it's awesome. So initial strategy, make sure you use this initially. If the objection persists, jump into one of these rebuttals. But honestly, that's everything for the cold calling objection rebuttals. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple stuff. Just like anything, this takes a lot of time, right, to get used to. It takes hours and hours, thousands of calls, thousands of hours of practice to get good at this stuff. And honestly, like, cold calling is honestly one of the best tools you can have in business, because you will never go hungry. If you can make cold calls and if you can sell, like if you can do the discovery call properly, then you're infinitely valuable to any business that's ever existed anywhere ever. And so if you ever think, oh, like if someone stripped away NorthFlow, Imperium, my other assets and streams of income, and then people were like, oh, well, what would you do if you had to start over? I'd be like, well, I'd get on cold calling. I'd just run a pay-per appointment cold calling thing and just do it freelance, and I'd be back up to 10, 20, 30k a month within a couple of weeks, right? When you can do this stuff, you become very useful. So that's everything for today's training video. That is how to overcome knee-jerk objections, and I hope you found this one useful. So yeah, I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Cheers.